This week, from flash floods to drought, extreme weather events are getting more and more common. What's the cost to countries and their people?
1 degree increase in the temperature outdoor will increase by 10% the air conditioning energy use.
Insuring against disaster. How are businesses hedging against the worst case scenarios? We speak to Munich Re's chief climate scientist.
Adaptation is key, sort of to bend this curve of ever increasing losses. And it needs a private and public sector cooperation.
And in the U.S., Greece, and Russia, man-made climate change is speeding the spread of wildfires. After a summer of devastating blazes, is it only likely to get worse?
With hotter temperatures and drier conditions lasting longer into the fall and winter than they used to, the fire season is also lasting longer.
I'm Kaylee Limes in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green. In just the last 7 months, the National Centers for Environmental Information estimates extreme weather has hit the U.S. economy for more than $20 billion. Businesses have been wrecked, supply lines destroyed, and no one has been able to predict where the next catastrophe will strike. So how do you keep your business running when any day could spell disaster? Earlier this year, Texas's grid froze and rolling blackouts were enforced. It's estimated around 700 people lost their lives. Then just a few months later, a heat dome made American sidewalks unsafe to walk on, and it's still unknown how many died. Now floods are hitting Europe, in a region that experienced profound drought just 18 months ago. These catastrophes are becoming part of everyday life, and businesses are struggling to keep up.
If you were to ask businesses what extreme weather means to them, well, one word would come up over and over again, and that word would be risk. As global temperatures rise and the climate becomes less and less stable, we're only going to see a rising cost in terms of lives and in terms of dollars. Imagine for a second that you're a business that moves a product from point A to point B. In a given year, you'd have a price estimate for that journey, but all of a sudden, there's a flood in the way. Well, that price estimate has just gotten a lot higher and the journey has just gotten a lot riskier. But it's not just businesses that move products around that are at risk. Imagine you're a data center and an extreme flood wipes out your power supply, or you're a bank and a forest fire means that you need to evacuate your employees. Everyone's at risk in an unstable climate. And when businesses are at risk, the first thing they try and do is pass that risk on to somebody else.
Passing on costs is a very normal part of what businesses do. It's the whole reason insurance exists, to lower risk and allow businesses to recoup some costs in the events of a disaster. It's an industry worth hundreds of billions, but even the sector's giants are struggling to keep up with the impacts of climate change.
If you lived on a floodplain or in the path of a hurricane, you'd be pretty likely to take out some home insurance. What you'd be doing here is asking an insurer to take on some of your risk in the hopes that in a disaster, you'd have some protection. Well, it's exactly the same for businesses. In a stable climate, the calculations insurers make are incredibly complicated. They are trying to predict the future after all. In an unstable climate, they may well be impossible. All we know about extreme weather is that it's likely to get more frequent and more severe. We don't know where it's going to strike next. Some insurers have begun talking publicly about adjusting their models for an unstable climate, but it remains to be seen if any of them will be successful. When you look away from insurance, you enter the slightly weird and slightly wonderful world of weather hedging. This includes products like weather derivatives, which are options contracts based on deviations in standard temperature, catastrophe bonds, commodities hedging, water trading, and a whole host of other things too. They're quite small markets at the moment, but have seen massive growth in 2020 and 2021. They are assets that are absolutely moving from the fringes further towards the mainstream.
Apart from insurance, there are other ways a company can hedge against climate disaster. The weather derivatives market grew 60% in 2020, and catastrophe bonds reached $100 billion of issuance in the same year. Water was added to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange last year, partly in the hopes it would help allocate resources to where they're needed most. For example, farms suffering from drought. In Europe, despite widespread flooding, water is currently trading at nearly its highest for over a decade.
As the cost in lives and dollars of catastrophes around the world and extreme weather events just increase, you should expect to hear a lot more about weather hedging from businesses.
One company that has proven itself to be a pioneer in both analyzing and insuring losses caused by man-made climate change is Munich Re. The reinsurer, based in Germany, is using its data to identify risk from extreme weather events and then develop solutions to minimize investment losses. I spoke to their chief climate scientist, Ernst Rauch.
If we analyze our data, our loss information, global loss information, together with meteorological data, we identify some regions where most likely, and I have to word it really carefully, but most likely climate change already plays a role. And these regions include some regions in the US, but also in Europe. And actually, it's not so much the tropical cyclones where we see this change. We see it rather with the so-called convective storms, where you have either hail, tornadoes, or very localized and very heavy precipitation and flash floods as a consequence.
So in terms of insuring against these kind of events, how much has Munich Re seen an increase in demand for that kind of protection?
Well, indeed, in the OECD countries, so the high-income countries, the demand has increased substantially in the course of the last 4 or 5 decades. What we call insurance gap, so that's the difference between the overall economic losses and the insured losses. This has reduced significantly in the last 4 decades. We had an insurance gap with respect to natural catastrophe insurance of around 75% in the 1980s. And today in the OECD countries, it's below 50%. It's still significant, but below 50% now. Where we do not observe a change is in the non-OECD countries, so the low-income countries. And to get back to your question, yes, we see an increase in demand actually since decades. It's not a new development, and it's a development where our industry, I think the private sector insurance company, really provides obviously the right products and services.
So it's one thing to get insured against potential damages, but I'm sure there are also things you can do to mitigate the potential damages you could face, better ways to build, maybe even building in different locations that maybe are a bit safer. What are some of the things you would advise?
Yeah, to adapt to these risks, especially to the ever increasing risks in those areas which are already today more impacted by climate change than others. Adaptation is key, to bend this curve of ever increasing losses. And it needs a private and public sector cooperation. On a community level, this is the role of the public sector to protect communities with respect to flooding, building levees, but also getting better engaged in land use plannings. If there are dedicated flood zones, do not really allow new settlements there. So that's the public sector's role. But the private sector, so the individual homeowners or business owners, they have a job to do as well. And that's with respect to hardening their properties, reducing the vulnerability of their properties. That can be, for instance, with making windows and doors waterproof, improving building codes, or using different building materials, which are better in regions with high exposures to high winds, for instance. And again, really the key is the adaptation to these perils. And once this happens to a better degree than today, I'm pretty sure that we will no longer see this ever increasing losses and, as a consequence, insurance premiums.
So people will be building better, which may reduce some of those losses. Is there any reason to believe, at the end of the day, you are a climate scientist, do you have any reason to believe that the events themselves won't get any worse from here?
Well, I think the message is rather they will get worse, the events themselves, so nature. And that's one of the many impacts from climate change, that in many regions in the world, the frequency and intensity of severe and intense weather-related catastrophes will increase. And I have to admit, will increase further. In some regions, we already observe this increase. And that can only be tackled in the long term, in the long run, by reducing the drivers of these change, of climate change, and that's greenhouse gases. And that's with respect to what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is calling for, actions to bring our global carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions, and other greenhouse gases basically down to zero by the midst of this century.
Coming up, the power of extreme heat. In a summer that has seen record temperatures across the globe, devastating wildfires have raged from the U.S. to Turkey to Russia. What's causing them? And how can countries cope? This is Bloomberg Green.
Here are a few stories we are following this week in Green. Extinction Rebellion protesters in London are targeting the country's big accounting firms. The Green Group says the industry is failing in its duty to call out greenwashing and climate risk. Hundreds of activists are taking part in 2 weeks of demonstrations in the city with the aim of disrupting what it calls, quote, business as usual. Also, the world's largest container shipping company is making a $1.4 billion investment in a greener fleet. Maersk has ordered 8 new vessels that can be propelled by cleanly made methanol instead of an oil-based fuel. They'll replace older ships in the company's fleet, saving about 1 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. Shipping accounts for almost 3% of man-made carbon dioxide emissions, a level that's been rising in recent years. And that's your Green Brief. Kaylee?
Thanks, Jen. In a summer already full of extreme weather, it's the heat waves roasting millions across 3 continents that are confirming climate experts' worst fears. The world is getting hotter and fast. Sizzling temperatures in the U.S., Europe, and North Africa are creating dangerous health conditions, causing droughts, and even worse, fueling wildfires. Our climate and disasters reporter Josh Saul explains why the flames wreaking havoc across the world may be set to get worse.
This is a terrible year for wildfires. Already this year in the United States, 50% more land has burned compared with last year, with 107 big fires and over 2 million acres currently in flames. Record high temperatures in southern Europe have led to wildfires in Greece and Turkey, and wildfires began in Siberia earlier than normal. Human-caused climate change has led to higher temperatures around the world, which speeds the spread of wildfires. Dry air saps all the moisture out of forests and brush, making them explosively flammable. And once a fire starts, hot temperatures and drier air helps the fire spread and makes it harder to extinguish. Turkey is battling its worst wildfires in decades, which has killed at least 4 people and caused thousands of evacuations. And Greece had its hottest day on record, and wildfires forced a dozen villages near Athens to evacuate. California has seen a massive 151% increase in the number of acres burned across the state when compared with last year. An operations chief with the U.S. Forest Service said, "These are not the normal fires anymore. It's just intense fire behavior, and it's not what we are used to." The bootleg wildfire in Oregon grew to be the biggest in the U.S. last month. All those wildfires burning the western U.S. and Canada put off so much smoke that the hazy overcast drifted eastward over cities like Chicago, New York City, and Boston. The smoke was so bad that it made the sun appear red in New York City. The western U.S. has also been hit by an unstoppable drought, draining water reservoirs to their bottoms, setting off fights over river water, and turning trees and shrubs from shade into tinder. The fire season in the Arctic, which normally runs from May to October, started early this year, with fires sparking in Siberia in April. All these fires have huge financial and political implications. Canadian wildfires have forced lumber companies to slow production, which has spiked lumber futures and has even slowed grain imports into the country. And in Turkey, the fires engulfing the southern coast of the country for over a week now have sparked criticism against the president for a slow and chaotic response. With hotter temperatures and drier conditions lasting longer into the fall and winter than they used to, the fire season is also lasting longer. As one climatologist told me recently, it's not a fire season anymore. It's a fire year.
That was our climate and disasters reporter, Josh Saul. And while Europe and the U.S. may have to get used to scorching temperatures, there's one part of the world that is built to withstand the heat, the Middle East. But there's signs that temperatures around the Persian Gulf are getting too hot for even the locals. Temperatures in Kuwait hit 129.2 degrees Fahrenheit or 54 degrees Celsius this summer, a level which is dangerously close to the so-called wet bulb temperature, the limit for what is survivable for a human, even in the shade. Our reporter Simone Foxman in Doha looked into how the region was adapting to the heat.
July 2021 was the hottest month in modern history, and few places were hotter than the Middle East and North Africa, where sea and land temperatures neared or hit new records. Here in the Gulf, we're used to scorching heat, with temperatures that regularly top 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Scientists like George Zitis say this heat will only get more extreme.
Have very strong amounts of solar radiation, very low cloud cover and precipitation. This is causing the extreme environmental conditions that we see in the region. And we expect this to become worse in the future.
Data studied by Zitis and his team indicate that business as usual in greenhouse gas emissions will soon cause unprecedented heat waves. In the Mediterranean, heat and a decline in precipitation could drive more intense droughts, like the ones that created the conditions for wildfires in places like Greece, Turkey, and Algeria this summer. In the Gulf, heat waves could top 56 degrees Celsius and last for weeks.
Actually, we're expecting to reach the limits of survivability in parts of the region, so human discomfort will be really high. We expect to have direct health impacts. For example, heat strokes, heat-tolerant animals could be affected.
Coastal cities in the Persian Gulf like Dubai and Doha have already felt conditions close to these limits. Humans regulate their body temperature by sweating, but at high enough levels of heat and humidity, a so-called wet bulb temperature, sweat won't evaporate fast enough for humans to keep body heat in check for more than a few hours. Air conditioning is mostly ubiquitous in the Gulf, but temperature extremes pose a new challenge.
When the dry bulb and wet bulb temperature increases, the humidity goes up, and these big cooling towers, which are responsible for giving us the cold air inside, will not be enough to give you a comfortable temperature inside the house.
Flashy plans for futuristic, sustainable cities, like Neom in Saudi Arabia, may someday allow for more efficient living in the Gulf. But for now, inefficient air conditioning and energy subsidies are two of the reasons these countries are among the world's worst polluters.
We did some analysis and we found that 1 degree increase in the temperature outdoor will increase by 10% the air conditioning energy use in Riyadh. But there is limited initiative, at least at the existing, what we call the old building, the retrofit. And actually, this is not a problem for the Gulf, that's throughout the world.
But there's a potential upside: jobs.
We estimate about 250,000 per year over 10 years in Saudi Arabia.
We mitigate climate change. We reduce the amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The temperature will still increase, but in a much slower pace. And this will provide us the window that we need to adapt.
In Doha, Simone Foxman, Bloomberg News.
Coming up, hurricanes and pocket change. How is climate affecting the consumer? We look at the link between natural disasters and inflation. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. Well, extreme weather events are becoming more destructive, disruptive, and costly. Floods, fires, hurricanes, and droughts cost the U.S. alone almost $100 billion in 2020. But as well as destroying houses and claiming lives, they are also having a tangible impact on people on the other side of the world. Our reporter Laura Wright broke down the link between natural disasters and inflation.
Floods in China, droughts in Canada, and frost in Brazil. What do all these things have in common? They're all weather events being made worse by climate change, and they are having a profound impact on consumer prices.
We clearly see inflation now in the United States.
It is obvious that we have a very, very important spike on inflation.
I'm somewhat on the side of those who think that we may well have an incipient inflation problem.
Obviously, one needs to watch this very carefully.
The global supply chain is not working exactly as it should be.
Rise in raw materials is such that we have to act.
And our instinct is this will persist for some time.
From asset managers to manufacturers, paint makers to policymakers, inflation is a topic at the forefront of corporate concerns this year, and it's being worsened by climate change. In Brazil, at the end of July, a severe frost ravaged major Arabica coffee areas, and the timing of the cold snap meant that young plants were most at risk, which could affect production levels for years. Joseph Rayner, a grower in the south of Minas Gerais, said the freezing temperatures hurt as many as 120,000 coffee seedlings out of 200,000 planted less than a year ago. And that was borne out in coffee prices. Arabica futures, which account for 3/4 of the world's coffee production, surged 17%, topping $2 a pound for the first time since 2014.
Like most coffee suppliers, we are hedged, and so there's some forward cover here for the rest of this year and part of next year. But obviously at some point you run through that hedging position, and then you do face those higher prices.
Meanwhile, dry conditions in Canada, coupled with record-breaking heat, triggered hundreds of wildfires, with blazes spanning east across 5 provinces and nearly as far north as the Arctic Ocean. Fires have been so treacherous that thousands of rail cars carrying grain for export have been idled for weeks. The drought is also withering crops in Canada's breadbasket prairie provinces and in the northern US, forcing farmers to take the rare step of baling up their low-yielding wheat and barley stems to sell as livestock feed. Prices for the region's spring wheat and the variety used to make flour for bagels and pizza crusts recently touched the highest in more than 8 years.
The biggest pressure we have as it relates to inflation, because the price pressure or the need for us to increase prices comes from the fact that we're seeing inflation on our input cost, and that is the most pronounced in North America, in the US.
These price increases are ultimately to be transferred to the consumer. Inflation in June in the USA rose to 5.4%, the highest since 2008. Food prices have risen by 2.4% in the last 12 months. And when it comes to brands, J.M. Smucker, the US food company behind Folgers and Dunkin' Coffee, said it was planning to increase prices across varieties of categories in the last month.
The overall food inflation rate is not that much higher than it normally is. There are certain selected items in the grocery store that folks may see, at least for a period of time, increased costs. But we think this is going to even out, if you will.
But even if the economists and politicians say that price increases won't last, what's unique right now is that extreme weather seems to be pounding almost every region of the globe. No other industry is more at the mercy of sun, rain, and heat than agriculture. And when changes in the weather can upend a farmer's fortunes overnight, you might notice it with that morning cup of joe.
That's it for this week's edition, but keep the conversation going. You can follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lyons in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green.